Good morning, Caroline.
Good morning, Avi. How you doing today?
Oh my God, do we really want to go there? No, I want to go to where I want to go with you because
Okay.
I had a face off with Yariv Oppenheimer, the ex-head of Peace Now, last night, and just so frustrated with all the lies he's allowed to say. It's him, and it's just crazy. So I'm going to go with you right now. Okay, there's so much important stuff to talk about, and our connection is weak. I hope it stays. I don't know why.
All right.
The settlement bill. What
Right.
people actually bothers me is that people call this historic. And even when I was on I-24 News last night, they go, there is no legal precedent for Israel to be able to have land or build in Judea and Samaria. It's crazy how international law from the beginning of the 20th century, 1920, 1922, San Remo, League of Nations, it's all as if it doesn't exist. And our own press, our own politicians don't even deal with, no, it's not legal precedent. What's historic about it? Of course we're allowed to build in our ancient homeland, our ancestral homeland, also from international law perspective. So talk to us. What is going on with this historic settlement bill?
Well, I think that, there are a couple of things we have to understand. One is that this is a law that basically is about protecting the civil rights of Jews and Muslims and Christians in Judea and Samaria. Because under the current legal regime of the PLO, it's a capital offense for Palestinian Arabs to sell land to Jews. And by the way, it's also a capital offense for them to sell land to Christians. And Christians are first and foremost about protecting the civil rights of Jews who want to buy land but to Arabs who want to sell land. Because all it does is right now, under the legal regime, which is military law in Judea and Samaria, the military commander is only able to use eminent domain for military purposes.
Right.
So, like the security fence, you can expropriate private land with compensation for the purpose of building the fence because that's clearly necessitated by military needs.
Right.
But you're not allowed to expropriate land for civilian purposes, even though this is something that's allowed in democracies all over the world, including, by the way, the United States. There are dozens of court cases where eminent domain has been upheld as pertaining as well to civilian building activities. So this is not a radical law, except to the extent that Israel is saying, okay, the civil rights of Palestinians, their property rights are being denied first and foremost by the PLO, which is executing these people generally with extrajudicial executions carried out either by Palestinian security forces that are, let's not forget, trained and funded by American forces with American tax dollars. Right. Or they're executed by terrorist militias that are acting in conjunction with the Palestinian Authority. So, in order to protect the lives of these people, it was necessary to extend eminent domain to this area because, again, they get compensated 120% of the value of their property in order to enable them to essentially sell it without being killed.
Right, and this is an important point. I don't know how many people realize it. You're basically letting us know this new settlement law is also to protect the Arabs from not being killed by their own leadership that has been propped up by the European Union, taxpayer money of Americans, etc.
Yeah. So I think that first of all, you have to understand that. Second of all, you have to understand that, under the Obama administration, Israel was squeezed to the point where it was not able to recognize the property rights of Jews just because they're Jews. Right. Not only in Judea and Samaria, but also in Jerusalem. So you're having these, so-called building permits being given for several thousand, I think 3,000, 4,000, I don't remember.
We're up to 5,000 right now.
But the thing is that a lot of these are just stalled projects that were initiated years and years ago, but they were blocked from proceeding by American pressure. So that right now what you really see is just sort of an opening of the floodgates to things that have been blocked due to American discrimination against Jews in Israel to the benefit of Palestinian terrorists who want to execute everybody who sells land to non-Muslims. Right. So I think that this is very important. You can see this almost as a counter-jihadist move to say that no, Palestinian Muslim terrorists are not able to deny the property rights of Arabs or of Jews, not in Jerusalem, not in Judea and Samaria, not anywhere, and that Israel's going to uphold the civil rights of these people.
So you know what gets me on the legal level? Because I recently found out that according to Jordanian law,
Right.
and according to Ottoman law, the law was that if homes are built mistakenly on someone else's property, they are compensated
Right.
with money. And then we are told that, wait, the Israeli system, we're using Jordanian law and Ottoman law in Judea and Samaria.
Right.
So why was that never upheld, since it already is according to Jordanian law and Ottoman law, which hopefully
Right, so it's
we're moving
really
away from.
interesting because the biggest outcry here on the settlement regulation law is from the left here in Israel,
Right.
first and foremost, right? And so people like thankfully, former Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni, thankfully, former Justice Minister Tzipi Livni,
Right.
and hopefully forever former Justice Minister or anything Minister Tzipi Livni is saying this is going to open up Israel to criminal prosecutions. And all of these people are screaming and saying that by recognizing Jewish rights, Jewish civil rights, that Israel is a lawbreaker. Now, since this is on its face absurd, right, from a legal perspective, you have to wonder what's motivating these people, right? And I would say that some of this is just vindictiveness, that they realize that they don't have the political power to defeat Zionists in this country, whether they're religious Zionists or non-religious Zionists, who believe that Jewish civil rights are meaningful and have to be protected.
Right.
And so what they're doing, instead of accepting the fact that Jews have civil rights and moving on and trying to figure out something else to champion other than persecution of their fellow citizens, they're trying to move it out of the democratic order of Israel, where they cannot win a majority because the vast majority of Israeli citizens don't understand why they wouldn't want to uphold Jewish civil rights. And they're moving into the international sphere. So they're using, international pressure against Israel. Now, it worked, right? It worked for 8 years under Obama, and to a certain extent, it also worked under the Bush administration, which was saying, like Elliot Abrams, who's now being possibly about to be appointed to be the Deputy Secretary of State. So he was like pro-Israel because he was saying, no, Jews should be allowed to build, but only in settlement blocks and only vertically, not horizontally. So we're allowed to live in little houses, little units of high-rise apartments. But God forbid, a Jew should want a farm. A Jew should want to have a ranch. A Jew should want to have a private home with a yard like I have. That's not acceptable because building inside of the blocks means building vertically, not horizontally.
Makes total sense.
Right?
Makes total sense.
Right, and so it's basically ghettoizing the Jews in these tiny little enclaves. In the meantime, giving free rein to the Palestinians to do whatever they want, to be scofflaws of their own building laws, not to mention ours, and take over the land and make essentially all of these little tiny areas where Jews are allowed to live in high-rise apartments indefensible.
So I'm glad you brought up Tzipi Livni and her trying to internationalize this since the left can't win in Israel. Did you hear what Yitzhak Herzog said in the Knesset and how Zev Elkin responded to him?
No.
Oh my God.
Why
Ready
don't
for
you
this?
tell us? Tell
All right,
us.
here we go. And I want Yitzhak Herzog also
The
took
head
that
of the
same,
opposition.
the head of the Labor Party, which set up this country, right? They ran this country for decades.
Well, there were different labor politicians at the time.
They were 100%. So so he basically said exactly what Tzipi Livni was saying, like, "Oh no, we're going to be vilified in the world. The international court's going to take us, and it is horrible for Israel, horrible for our soldiers." Zev Elkin gave an epic response.
Oh yeah?
He said, "Your grandfather is the one who stood in front of the United Nations
His father,
and ripped
actually,
up,
his father.
his father, and ripped up their declaration, saying, how dare you say these things? You have no importance to be making such decisions. And you, the son of that man who knew how to stand up for Israel and the Jewish people in the international forum, you are throwing us to the door." I'm now not using his exact language. "You're now throwing us back to that international forum as they're supposed to be the ones in charge of us?" Oh my God.
Fantastic. And you know what? I was at a forum that Bar Ilan University set up to discuss Chaim Herzog's historic speech at the UN General Assembly in 1975, when the General Assembly passed the anti-Semitic resolution saying that the Jewish National Liberation Movement, Zionism, is a form of racism. And so Yitzhak Herzog was the keynote speaker there, and he gave this sort of he was very uncomfortable with having to embrace the legacy of his father. You could tell.
Really?
Well, you could tell because right now the legacy, the record that he is running on, and the issue that he is making his name on is really saying that there's legitimacy to this international diplomatic pogrom against the Jewish state, and by necessity, right? Because again, the left in Israel cannot get a parliamentary majority, so they work through the Supreme Court, they work through anti-Israel non-governmental organizations that are funded by foreign governments, right? And they work in the court of public opinion internationally to try to vilify Israel in order to put international pressure on Israel that's going to weaken the political opposition that they cannot beat at the ballot box. And so, this is the situation that we're having here in this country. But again, just to go back to the original issue of the settlements regulation.
Good, I was going to bring you back, yeah.
The regulations law, I think it's very important for people, because you're going to hear a lot in the New York Times and even in the Israeli press, of course, about, how this law is going to change everything. So first of all, what it does is try to rectify a non-recognition and a non-protection of the civil rights of everybody who lives in Judea and Samaria to their property.
Right.
And
again, when she says everyone, for everyone who came in, because you mentioned at the beginning, it's to protect the rights of Jews, Muslims, and Christians, everyone, and to save the lives of Muslims not to be killed by their
right.
leadership.
And this is something that, to the extent that it's historic or revolutionary, it just shows how horribly distorted the legal regime in Judea and Samaria has become, due in large part to American pressure. And so, now that we have a new administration in the United States and the Trump administration is doing something, if anything is revolutionary, it's the Trump administration's positions on Jewish rights, which is that they're accepting them, right? For the first time in 50 years or something like that, the Americans are accepting the Jews have civil rights and we have property rights, and settlements are not illegal, they are legal. And if a willing buyer is able to buy land from a willing seller, then there is nothing illegal about that action, whether they're Israelis or I don't know, British or Chilean or whatever, everybody has the right to buy and sell property. And the notion that because of your religion or your nationality you should be barred from doing so is antithetical to, everything that the free world is supposed to stand for.
Yeah, no, for sure. The hypocrisy of the free world is they are supporting an apartheid against Jews.
Right.
And blatantly so, and they won't admit it, they won't even go there.
No, they are projecting their own racism, their own bigotry, their own anti-Semitism onto the objects of their hatred. This wasn't the first time that we've been in this situation, and unfortunately won't be the last time, but we have to understand what we're dealing with here. The bigots here are the people who are saying that Jews don't have rights, or that Jews' rights are inherently immoral, because there's clearly something inherently immoral with Jews, right? Because if everybody has rights except us, right, what are you saying? If everybody has the right to property except Jewish people, then you're saying that there's something different about Jews. So this is the this is the very definition of bigotry, and of course the very definition of anti-Semitism. And so somebody like Bougie Herzog not being able to identify it and walk in those footsteps of his father, right, and defend Jewish rights is really, troubling and sad.
I'm going to throw something out there, even though we didn't go in that direction. I'm also afraid of Yair Lapid. I'm afraid of people voting for Yair Lapid, because he's not saying much different than Bougie Herzog and Tzipi Livni dealing with this settlement issue and the whole Judea and Samaria. And he's trying to play it on the one hand, trying to get right-wing voters.
Right.
There are a lot of right-wing voters out there who are happy with him. And I believe they're all being led astray.
Well, it wouldn't be the first time, right? I mean, when Rabin ran for election in '92, I voted for him, right? Because I was in the army, and here's this guy, Mr. Security, and he's saying he will never recognize the PLO. He will never negotiate giving away land on the Golan Heights. He will never allow for a Palestinian state to be established. So what's the difference between this guy, Rabin, and Yitzhak Shamir from Likud? Nothing. And in the meantime, Shamir was being demonized by the media, right, left, and center, was calling him corrupt. And so I believed them, and I voted for Rabin. I remember I was in officer training course at the time. And then he turned around like 6 months later and recognized the PLO and started negotiating away the Golan Heights, even to the point that of putting, Jerusalem on the agenda with the initial agreement with the PLO. And this was something that was breathtaking in its betrayal of the Israeli voters. We saw it again in 1999 when Barak essentially ran as a Likud clone. Right, and he was able to, and Bibi, just as happened with Shamir 7 years earlier, was being portrayed as some sort of corrupt, horrible person, evil, bad, mean, and everybody hates him. And Barak, in the meantime, no negotiations on the Golan Heights, and the Oslo deal is a bad deal, and I'll get a better deal. It was all a lie, right? He turned around, went to Camp David, offered them the Temple Mount, right? And, pulled out of Lebanon, gave the entire country to Hezbollah, and pretended that this was somehow or another going to be good for Israel's security. I mean, it was a disaster.
Right.
And, so the point is that left-wingers in Israel understand that the only way to get elected is to pretend that they're not left-wing. And so Yair Lapid is just following in the form of, so many others before him by pretending away and hiding the fact that, yes, if he becomes the prime minister in Israel, then he's going to just be another leftist who's going to want to give away the store, who's going to demonize his fellow citizens, who's going to suck up to all of the jihadists and going to say that we have to do this because of American pressure and blah, 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 blah. So, yeah, you're right. I mean, there's no reason why, it's sort of fool me once, shame on me, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. I can say in my own defense that I didn't fall for it in 1999 and I didn't vote for Barack, but I know plenty of people who did.
Right.
Plenty of people believed his lies. Plenty of people believed the propaganda about Bibi. Plenty of people were taken in because why not? I mean, you're being served up a diet 24/7 of hatred and bile against right-wing leaders while, has anybody called Yair Lapid? I mean, have any of these media types that are breathlessly following him and hoping and praying to Tinkerbell that he's going to become the next prime minister, are any of them asking him hard questions? No, because they know that he can't answer them. Right. So, it's up to us to point it out, and so good you did it.
Folks, it's up to us. Point out. Really, we'll vote for Yair Lapid. He's another mask as a right-winger who's really a left-winger. He is dangerous. All right, that's it for Yair Lapid. I'm going to go back to the settlement bill. I'm going to throw out a few different questions. Answer them as you want. One, is this going to be taken down? Is this going to be dismissed by Bagatz, by Israeli Supreme Court? And regardless if it is or if it isn't, how is the passing of the settlement bill help towards the eventual decision for sovereignty in Judea and Samaria?
Well, I mean, I think that it's very important for the Knesset to apply Israeli law over Judea and Samaria. As you know, I wrote a book about it, right? The Israeli Solution.
If you did not buy it, now's your chance to go buy the book.
Right. The Israeli Solution.
By Caroline Glick.
Right. A one-state plan for peace in the Middle East. So the point is that, when we look at the settlement regulations bill, what are they saying? They're saying, let's apply... the Knesset is making a determination about the land in Judea and Samaria. So one of the arguments that Herzog and others are making against it is, this is the beginning of the application of Israeli law to Judea and Samaria. And we have to say we hope so, because the truth of the matter is that it's completely illiberal to have 450,000 Israelis and 1.5 or 1.7 million Arabs living under military rule. I mean, the Arabs actually are in a worse situation. We're living under military rule, military government, which means no democracy. And they're living under the terrorist jackboot of the PLO, and, which will likely, if we allow things to continue as they are, be replaced by the jackboot of the holy rollers from Hamas.
Right, wait, I just want to clarify. 90% of all Arabs in Judea and Samaria are under the authority of the Palestinian Authority. They're not even under the military rule anymore. So just for those people who don't know, a very small minority of Arabs in Judea and Samaria are under the Israeli military rule. It's us, Jews, who are under this military rule. They're under their own terrorizing Palestinian Authority.
And as we see, the military government in Judea and Samaria is incapable of protecting the civil rights of Jews. Right? Because they're operating under an inherently anti-Semitic, illiberal legal code that is based upon the Jordanian legal code that was extant in these areas in 1967. This was an illegal Jordanian occupation, right? And we are using their laws as if they're the legitimate sovereign. I mean, these are people who massacred whole scale, talk about war crimes, burned alive the Jews of Kfar Etzion, and threw them into unlawful imprisonment during the war, where they were tortured and starved in Jordan, right? And we're using their legal code and pretending that this is somehow or another an enlightened liberal order or something that is reasonable. It's not reasonable. I mean, in the Golan Heights, the reason that Israeli law was applied there in 1981 is because the Syrians said, we're not going to make peace with you for 100 years. And in the meantime, the Golan Heights was under the military government that was being governed by the, completely retarded Syrian legal code. I mean, you couldn't register marriages, you couldn't register deaths, you couldn't register divorce, you couldn't do anything under this completely pathetic piece of garbage called Syrian law, right? And so how are we supposed to do this? They said they're not going to make peace with us. We're going to keep it, right? For the foreseeable future, for generations, right? And we're going to govern everybody who lives there under this pathetic excuse for a legal regime? I mean, of course not. So the same has become, it was one thing, it was stupid to maintain this, in Judea and Samaria in the first place. But when you have, 500,000 people living here who are Israeli citizens, and we're living under military government that is based upon this silly, this terrible, this backwards, this illiberal Jordanian legal regime. And what are we talking about here? Talk about second-class citizens. It's like, who wants to live under this legal regime to begin with? And why is Israel maintaining it? So to the extent that we apply Israeli law to these areas, either directly or indirectly, partially or, or completely, the point is that what this is about is this is a progressive move. This is a liberal move. This is expanding the civil rights, protecting the civil rights of everybody who lives in these areas. And, everything gets lost. These basic facts are lost under, dogma posing as rational argumentation. And it's a really big problem, and I want to swing over for a second to what's going on in Washington, because, we've had this on Friday or Thursday, right? I sent off my columns for Friday's newspaper, and then I see, oy vavoy, the sky is falling, right? The Trump administration just said that they're against the settlements, right? And you get, in my own newspaper, you get the screaming headline in the Jerusalem Post, and then, followed rapidly by screaming headlines in every other newspaper in the world. The White House has just embraced Obama's position on settlements, right? And if you read the text of the statement that the White House put out, the exact opposite is the case, right? So they sort of said, well, it was a very pro-settlement statement. You've never had a statement more pro-settlement. So you could say the tone was bad, right? But they said it might not be helpful. What does that mean? But it might be helpful. Yeah. On the one hand, it might not be, but on the other hand, it might be. The White House refuses to say that they're for Palestinian statehood. They're refusing to meet with the PLO. They're telling the PLO that if they continue to try to pursue and prosecute Israelis in international courts, that they're going to use UN forums. They're going to lose U.S. money. International forums. Right. No, they're going to redesignate the PLO a terrorist organization. Right. Stop recognizing them. Close down all of their offices in the United States, and that's it. In other words, they're saying if you continue this policy, which is, of course, we see supported by the Israeli left, right, of internationalizing so-called the thing to make, the Zionism is racism resolution from 1975 that was overturned in 1991. If you want to try to make this the means through which you're going to force Israel to its knees, well then we're not going to have anything to do with you. We're going to do what we should have done a long time ago, which is redesignate you guys a terrorist organization. And here I just want to add, because I'm so sick and tired of people pretending that the PLO is not a terrorist organization. Did you know that Fatah terrorists, during the second Intifada, so-called, the Palestinian terror war from 2000 until it was finally squelched by Israel in 2004, more or less, that Fatah terrorists from Fatah, the political party, right, they killed more Israelis than Hamas did? Did they really? Yes. I believe it. And they carried out more terrorist attacks than Hamas. So we're all... Fatah is Palestinian Authority. Fatah
is the ruling party of the Palestinian Authority.
It's the largest faction established by Yasser Arafat in Kuwait in 1957, 10 years before the so-called occupation started, right? And then it was brought into the PLO in 1968, I think, and it is the largest faction in the PLO, and it is the ruling party of the Palestinian Authority, which is the PLO, and they are terrorists, and the Americans, they murdered, right? They were responsible for the murder of U.S. Embassy personnel in Gaza in 2003, in October of 2003, and rather than pursue the murderers, right, the Americans just turned their back on the entire investigation. The FBI closed it down after a couple of years because they didn't want to go there. Right? They wanted to continue to pretend that the PLO was a peace partner for Israel. So that this is even American citizens on duty as American citizens, as opposed to just American citizens who are murdered because they happen to be in Israel. Right? American citizens working for the U.S. Embassy were murdered by PLO terrorists in 2003 because they were American embassy personnel.
And the U.S. did nothing.
And the U.S. closed the investigation on it because they didn't want to pursue where the leads were going to take them, because it was going to prove that the PLO and the Palestinian Authority was responsible for their murder.
Right. All right. All this is very important. I'm going to return to a point you mentioned and clarify for people. And then two last things. All right? And we're going to get to David Friedman also. We're going to talk about David Friedman in a minute.
David Friedman is the most important thing that we have left to talk about.
All right, so I want to finish the settlement bill for a second. Right. First of all, if you understand what Caroline is saying, if the Israeli Supreme Court dismisses, knocks down, makes illegal the new settlement law that was just passed, it is the Israeli Supreme Court that are going against civil rights. It's them who are going against the ability for everyone to have civil rights in Judea and Samaria, including the Muslims. So that is the hypocrisy of it all. Someone is mentioning a number of times here in the comments that they have lost faith in Israeli government institutions, in the right wing not being able to rule. That we have right wing governments, and it's always the left wing agendas. And even with this right wing government, the most right wing government, Amona was just destroyed. What do you have to say to those people who are getting fed up that we've for years voted right and we still get horrible, destructive left?
Because I would say that I sympathize, but you're looking at the wrong problem. Netanyahu and Ayelet Shaked and Naftali Bennett and Ophir Okunis and Gilad Erdan and all the rest of them, they didn't. And the police, by the way, nobody who was there in Amona, nobody who was fighting for Amona wanted to get to the point where last week 20 Israeli families were rendered homeless, 42, for no reason, and 9 now in Ofra are looking towards the same sort of thing. Nobody wanted to get there, so that everybody that people were demonstrating against, as opposed to what happened, for instance, in Gaza, where it was a government decision and a government program to expel 10,000 Jews from their homes. Right. Here, you had a government who opposed this, who wanted to keep them in their homes, who wanted them to remain there, who did not want to evacuate them, who did not want to expel them, who did not want to destroy them. There were only two people, or one institution and one person who were responsible for what happened in Amona. The institution was the radicalized Supreme Court, and the person was Treasury Minister Moshe Kahlon, who heads the Kulanu party.
I was going to take you there.
Because the reason that the right can't rule, the reason that the right-wing governments are consistently coerced into implementing the radical anti-Israel left's agenda is because we do not have a parliamentary majority in Knesset to reform our completely out-of-control court system and our completely out-of-control prosecution. All right? We don't have 61, fingers who are going to vote in favor of reform of the courts. And the reason we don't have it is because Moshe Kahlon, apropos of absolutely nothing, right, announced during the coalition talks that he was not going to join the government unless he had the freedom to protect democracy, meaning the Supreme Court.
Stop all changes to the Supreme Court.
To prevent the people's will from becoming law in this country, so that Moshe Kahlon alone, right? He is the reason why every single attempt by this government to reform the judiciary, to reform the legal system in Israel has been stymied, because he is blocking it all.
Right.
And, this is not for ideological reasons, right? This guy formed Kulanu after a career in the Likud.
He probably was bribed by Noni Moses and Amos Shoket.
Well, he certainly has received kid gloves treatment
from the media.
Right, from the media, even though every single one of his economic programs is stupid and destructive to the Israeli economy. I mean, he has these tax proposals where he wants to tax people who own three apartments,
and they're taxed on a third apartment.
It makes no sense. It's not going to decrease rents. It's not going to decrease property prices. The only thing that decreases property prices is more supply, right? I mean,
build in Judea and Samaria.
Well, yes,
build where we have land.
Build in the Negev, right?
Build in the Negev.
We were in the Negev last week, and and we were driving up from Eilat and driving through the Negev. And you see, right, that the Bedouins are taking over the land.
Right.
I mean, everywhere you go.
Are they building up or are they building across?
Yeah, exactly. They're building across.
And taking over the land, and the Supreme Court legalizes all their illegal building. Wait, so I want to dumb down the point. I want to dumb down the point of the Supreme Court, and I'm going to use your terminology, and I've used your terminology. What we see in Israel is a power struggle between the government and the Supreme Court. And no matter what government we vote in, no matter how right-wing, the Supreme Court, which is ideological left, it doesn't use the law. It talks in the name of the law. It's not about law. It's their right-wing extremist ideology. The Supreme Court is conducting
lawfare against Israel.
Correct. So the only way to change policy in Israel is to change the Supreme Court. And the person, I want to start a public campaign. I want people to realize the person stopping real change in Israel is one person that Caroline just mentioned, Moshe Kahlon of the Kulanu Party. He is stopping all changes necessary to be done in the legal system and in the Supreme Court so that this right-wing government can affect policy that we voted them to do. Him and only him alone. We have to conduct a really big public campaign to shame Moshe Kahlon for being the person. It's because of him Amona was destroyed. If he would have agreed to allow Seif 7 in the settlement bill, Amona would have stood. He right now is the person who was allowed for Amona to be destroyed, for the 9 houses in Ofra to be destroyed, for anything else that's stopping right-wing policy to be enacted by this right-wing government. It is Moshe Kahlon who is the stopgap. We have to get public pressure on Moshe Kahlon so that he is shamed into stopping to defend the Supreme Court from being changed so that it is truly a legal establishment and not overruling Israel's elected government.
Not a judicial tyranny.
Not a judicial tyranny.
I agree with you. I've been saying this since the beginning of the government, that the person who has to be put under pressure by the public is Moshe Kahlon, because he is the weak link. He is the spoiler. He is the reason why we can't make democratic reforms in this country to empower the Knesset, which is the sovereign. I mean, they're the repository of the people's will. We don't vote for the Supreme Court. We don't vote for specific ministers. We don't vote for a prime minister in this country. It's all by a proportional representation that we determine by voting for a party in the Knesset. And the Kulanu party, which of course ran as a right-wing party that was running Moshe Kahlon to be treasury minister,